what plants are easy, what plants are hard, and what plants are in between? That's a question you'll have to ask yourself at some point if you want to keep the right plants for you. So that's why I put together a list of the top 10 easiest aquarium plants to keep, in my opinion. Okay, so let's get into the video. The first plant on our list is Java Fern. The Java Fern is a low-light plant that does not require CO2. Java Fern gets between 6 and 14 inches and should be placed in your midground or background. They are a very slow-growing species of plant that require water temperatures between 68 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. They require pHs between 6.0 to 7.5, but on average they normally can handle slightly higher pHs. They are a relatively cheap plant that you shouldn't really be concerned about spending too much on, but there are some varieties that you will probably spend more on. Java Fern is an epiphyte plant, meaning that you should not plant it in your substrate, but instead you should attach it onto a piece of wood or rocks. Or they can even be left free-floating. The next plant on our list is Anubias Petite. Anubias Petite is also a low-light plant that also doesn't require CO2. Anubias Petite gets between 4 to 6 inches and should be placed mainly in the foreground. Anubias Petite also grows incredibly slow and requires water temperatures between 72 to 82 degrees and a pH between 6 and 7.5. Anubias are fairly cheap, but some variants of it can be slightly more expensive. Anubias also is an epiphyte plant, which, like Java Fern, means you should always attach it to your hardscape and not put it in your substrate, because that can kill it. The next plant on our list is Java Moss. Java Moss is a low-light plant that doesn't require CO2, and it gets 2 to 4 inches tall. Java Moss is a foreground plant, a carpeting plant, a floating plant. Java Moss can be a lot of things, because it's just a moss. It'll grow crazy in a tank and just like float. It doesn't have roots, so it doesn't really need to be attached to something, but you can attach it to things. It is a relatively slow grower and can be kept in temperatures between 60 and 80 degrees. Java Moss requires a pH between 5 and 8, meaning it's very resilient to different pHs. Also, it's a relatively cheap plant that you can just pretty much get at almost every fish store. The next plant on our list is Water Sprite. Water Sprite requires a moderate lighting and does not require CO2. It gets 12 to 18 inches tall, and its placement is background or floating. It has a very fast growth rate, and it requires a temperature between 70 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit, and a pH between 6.0 to 7.5. It is an incredibly cheap plant, made probably because of how fast it grows. I once at this point had this tank completely taken over by it until I kind of got rid of it because I didn't really enjoy it anymore. The fifth plant on the list is Vallisneria. It requires a moderate lighting, and CO2 is optional for it. It will grow better in CO2, but it doesn't require it. It gets anywhere between 12 to 74 plus inches because it's a massive plant that should always be kept in the background. Its growth rate is incredibly fast, and it can be kept in temperatures between 68 to 82. It requires a pH of between 6.0 to 8.5, meaning it is a very, very forgiving plant when it comes to pH. It's also incredibly cheap. Next up, we have Cyrptocoryne Wendtii. It is a low to high light plant, so it can be kept anywhere from low light to high light. CO2 is not necessary for it, and it gets to about 4 to 14 inches tall. It is a foreground, midground, and background. It's just like it's about how you trim this plant, and its growth rate is slow to moderate. Temperature requires is 68 to 82 degrees and a pH of between 6.0 to 7.8. Also, it's another relatively cheap plant. Plant number 7 is the Pygmy chain sword. It needs a moderate lighting, but CO2 isn't necessary for it. It gets about 4 inches tall and is a foreground to midground plant. Its growth is moderate to fast, and it requires a temperature between 72 and 80 degrees and a pH between 6.5 and 7.5. It is another relatively cheap plant like most of the plants on this list. The next plant on our list is the Amazon sword. Amazon swords can have lightings between low to moderate, and they do not require CO2. They can get anywhere between 12 to 18 inches and should be placed in the midground to background. They have a moderate growth rate and it can get in temperatures between 72 and 82 degrees. They need a pH between 6.0 and 7.8, and they're also another relatively cheap aquarium plant. My Amazon sword back here, I've had this for about 2 years now, and it's going strong. It's really healthy. It almost died a couple times, but right now, it's incredibly healthy. At number 9, we have Salvinia Minima. This is Salvinia Minima. It is a very fast-growing plant that requires moderate lighting and does not require CO2 at all because it gets the CO2 from the air because it's a floating plant. They get about 1.5 inches, not really, they kind of get like 1 inch wide, but they are a floating plant with a temperature requirement between 70 and 80 degrees and a pH requirement between 6.0 and 8.0. They are a really cheap plant because it just grows so much that I'm scooping this plant out and throwing it away every week, basically. The 10th and final plant on this list is Dwarf Rotala. It requires moderate to high lighting and does not require CO2. It gets between 2 to 12 plus inches. Its placement should be mid-ground to background, and its growth is moderate to fast. The temperature it requires is between 70 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and a pH between 5.5 to 7.5. It is an incredibly cheap plant and a very fast grower, and I would recommend it to anyone. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and giving this video a like. If you want to watch more content like this, check out the video over here.